news. Let's start with these retaliatory tariffs. What effects are they going to have, and why should we care?
Thank you. So it does have a big impact on global markets. If you look at the US and China, these are your biggest global players. So if we're having this kind of tensions between the two biggest global traders, you will then have the ripple effect that will be translated into your emerging markets. And we have begun to see most of those coming through in the markets as well as in the exchange rates.
Let's talk about those emerging markets with a focus on the African continent, and also take a look at how that's going to affect us in terms of AGOA even.
Yes. So that is really a big impact if you look at the Africa market, because if you look at where we sit as Africa, the bulk of our trade is with the US as well as China. So intertrade between Africa sits in the north of, say, 10%. The rest largely sits in that space. So we also are exposed insofar as the exchange rate is concerned. We have seen the impact on the rand. Year on year from January to date, we are seeing almost 16% downwards on the rand value. So that will definitely have an impact on emerging markets. And Africa in particular, because we are really sitting in that sensitive space, we are an emerging market. We are trying to grow our economies. We don't have the kind of cushions that the rest of the world, your Europe and your US have. So we really are looking into this with caution, and we do hope that the leaders will come together and find a solution around these issues.
One of the solutions that appears to have been proposed is this free trade agreement on the African continent. President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that it's going to create a market of about 1.2 to 1.5 billion people and 34 trillion rand in a market. So is that possible, seeing that only six nations have signed it? And how quickly would we see the effects of this counteracting these measures?
That's correct. So the Africa Free Trade Agreements are accepted, and it's really something that I would say it's long overdue. However, we need to obviously put a caution. These are long-term programs. As you've already indicated, only 6 nations have ratified. You need about an additional 16 for that agreement to come into effect. South Africa have just recently also signed, but all these agreements need to still go back to the different nations' parliaments for ratification. Once that has been implemented, then we may start to see some traction. But again, I don't think in the short term this would really alleviate or help in any way, because global trade by its nature, it's long term. So you're looking at long term a program, a sustainable program, to see real or fundamental shifts. So at the moment, not really. So, and there are other challenges that Africa has. The challenges in infrastructure. We need good infrastructure if we're going to facilitate trade. But the opening of our borders, Cape to Cairo, the movement of goods, I hope people in the future, that is a welcome development in that space. And I do think if you look at Africa, intertrade between Africa sits in the upward of, say, 10-15%. We trade, the bulk of our trade is with the rest of the nation, of the world, the US, Europe, and the US. So I feel we really need to grow our intertrade. If you look at the Eurozone, 70% of their trade happens within the Eurozone boundaries. They have the currency to back them in the form of euro. So I think these are some of the things that we may need to look at before we can start making some conclusions around the effect of the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
Let's go back to this trade war now. We know that we're focusing on the US and China at the moment, but it seems like the European Union and America are also going to shortly run into problems.
That is why we call it a global trade wars. This is not just limited to the US and China. Of course, these are the biggest player, but what we have seen is that the pushback by the US government insofar as trade is concerned, we've seen the same tariffs being imposed to some of European goods. Canada is one of those. Mexico, there are issues there. So the picture, the total picture, really, you are looking at a situation where you have an America versus the rest of the world situation, which is not good for trade. I think we need to promote trade. I think we need to have more open borders. We need to have more sort of trading with one another. And I personally believe that we have a platform through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, where these kinds of issues should rather be placed and be ventilated. I don't think we should really put ourselves in a position where we tweet ourselves into trade war. Every morning we wake up. These are sensitive matters. Global policy issues are very sensitive matters, and they need to be taken, to be adhered to or to be attended to with care. So what we have observed recently, it's not quite, to the spirit of the WTO and what we expect of global leaders and world leaders here.
Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Vince Ndove joining us there. It's time for a short break. I'll have more business news for you when we return. To stay with us.